Hi, welcome to my channel. Today in this video, we are going to see that how we can call database stored procedure or function in JPA repository. First, we will see how we can call simple database function which has no parameter, and then we will do some examples of calling function which accepts input and returns result in output parameter. We will also see different ways to call the DB function and handle the response. So without any delay, let's get started. In this video, we are going to cover a few ways that we can use to call the stored procedure, or in our case, DB functions. First, we can use query annotation that we have already seen in earlier video in this series. We can also use procedure annotation, but it has some limitation and we will talk about it later in this video. We can use entity manager to call stored procedures. And lastly, we will see that how we can use named stored procedure query annotation to define our stored procedure and how it overcomes the limitation of the procedure annotation. So let's begin with the query annotation first. To speed things up, I have already created few functions in our database. Okay, so let's start with the simple one first, which is get total employees. And what this function is doing, it accepts no parameter, returns the integer type of value, and in the body part we are doing simple count star from employees and storing the result into total employees variable, and finally returning the value of total employees to the caller. Okay, so let's see how we can call this function using query annotation. Back to Visual Studio Code, and in employee repository.java, let's define a function which returns an integer type of value, get total employees. Okay, and it accepts no parameter, fine, and then annotate this function with @query annotation and value equal to select get total employees, right? The name of the function. Okay, and this query is a type of native query, so we need to set native query attribute to true. Okay, and let's prefix this function name with enq for the sake of this tutorial, so that we can easily identify that this particular function is using native query. Save this file, go to employee service.java. Let's create a function which returns integer, and let's say get total employees. Okay, now here we need to return employee repository dot get total, enq get total employees. Okay, now we need to create an endpoint to access this function. So at get mapping total employees and public int get total employees accepts no parameter, right? And return employee service dot get total employees. Okay, now save this, run the application. Let's start the Postman. Now let's hit the endpoint, localhost 8080/employees/total employees. Send this, and we got total count of employees that we have in our table, right? Now let's generate the same result, but this time using @procedure annotation. Go to employee repository.java, copy this function, paste it here, and instead of enq, let's prefix this with proc, right? And here we need to annotate this function with @procedure and set the attribute procedure name, and inside this double quotes give the name of the function without the bracket and select. Okay, remove this native query attribute. Now save this, go to employee service.java. Let's use the same function But this time, instead of calling enqueue get total employees, let's call proc get total employees. Save this, run it again. Okay, hit send, and we are getting the same result. Okay, now let's call another function. Okay, let's call this one proc single output. This function accepts employee ID as input, and here in body we are doing select age from employees, where employee ID equal to this ID, and we are storing the result into this EMP page, which is an output parameter, right? So let's call this function. Back to Visual Studio Code, go to employee repository, copy this, paste it here, and here change the function name. Let's say get employee age, and we are going to pass an employee ID, right? And here change this function name to this one, and use the first parameter of this function as input, right? Save this, go to employee service, now copy this, paste it here, get employee age, enqueue get employee age, and we will be passing here employee ID. Okay, same employee ID goes here. Save this, now create an endpoint. Let's say get age and get employee age. We are going to pass the employee ID in request param. Okay, now here we need to call get employee age, employee ID. Save this, run it. We need to hit this endpoint, paste it here, employee ID, let's say 5. Okay, now send, and we are getting the age of employee whose ID is 5. Let's cross check this thing with our table. Employee ID 5, age is 27, right? Now let's call the same function, but this time using @procedure annotation. Copy this, paste it here, annotate it with @procedure, and procedure name going to be this. Delete this and this, and here let's say proc. Save this, now go to employee service, and let's change this function name to proc. Save this, run it again, hit send, and we are getting the same result, right? Now let's try this one this time. Okay, this function accepts one input and returns multiple output. Okay, and we are returning employee name and department whose ID is this employee ID, right? So let's call this function. Go to employee repository, now copy this, paste it here, and this time we are going to call this function. Okay, it accepts one parameter, so we don't need to do anything here. Let's change this function name to enqueue get name and depth. Okay, as we know that this function is going to return multiple outputs, so the integer alone cannot store that output value. Okay, so to handle that, let's define a map string. This is going to be the parameter name, and here the data type is unknown. Okay, so for that we use question mark, right? So let's save this. Now go to employee service.java, copy this, paste it here, and let's say get emp name and depth. Okay, and here we need to call enqueue get emp name and depth, right? The return type map string question mark, right? Save this. Now create an endpoint to call this function get name and depth. Okay, get name and depth. Here get emp name and depth. Change the return type map string question mark, right? Now save this, run the application, and we need to hit this endpoint get name and depth. Let's send. We are getting error, so we need to see what's going on here. No dialect mapping for JDBC type 1111. Let's see what's going on here. Oh yes, we need to call it like this. Select star from the function because it is going to return multiple parameters. If it is about a single parameter, then it really doesn't matter, but when it returns multiple parameter, the return type of this function you can see is record. Okay, and whenever the record type is returned by the function, we need to call it like this, select star from function. Okay, now save this and run it again. Now hit this endpoint. Okay, now let's do the same thing with add procedure annotation, but for that we need to annotate our entity class with add named stored procedure query, and here we need to set some attributes. The first attribute is name. This is going to be the alias name for our actual procedure. Okay, so emp dot, let's say, get emp name and depth. Okay, and then the actual procedure name, which is, let's copy it from here. Then we need to specify the parameters of our function at stored procedure parameter, right? And here we need to specify the mode of the parameter, which is parameter mode dot in. The name of the parameter is employee ID, and the type is integer dot class. The name of this parameter should be the same what we are having here. Okay, so we need to define these two as well, emp name and depth. So let's do that. Copy this, paste it here. This time it should be out. Emp name, this is string dot class, and last one is depth. Okay, now save this, go to employee repository, copy this, paste it here, procedure, and now instead of procedure name we need to say name. Okay, and here instead of actual procedure name we need to write this alias name. Okay, so copy it, paste it here, remove this and change this to proc. Okay, save it. Now go to employee service.java and change this to proc. Okay, now run the application. Hit send, and we are getting the same result. Okay, now let's call another one. Let's call this one. This procedure accepts employee ID and returns the table, actually the subset of employee table with two columns only, which is employee ID and employee name. Okay, so let's call this one. First let's do it using query annotation. Okay, paste it here, select star from this enqueue, let's say get id name. Okay, save this, go to employee service, copy this one, paste it here, get id and name. Okay, and enqueue get id and name. Save this. Now create one more endpoint here, get id and name, get id and name. Okay, okay, save this, run it again. So just change this one here, let's send. Okay, employee id 5 and employee name is Jan. Okay, now let's see what happens if we try to do the same thing, but this time with procedure annotation. Earlier we were calling our function through name stored procedure query, because procedure annotation somehow is not able to determine the return type of the result. So what we did, we created a name stored procedure query, and there we have defined the output parameter and its type. Okay, but this time we do not have any output parameter, we are returning the whole table instead. Okay, and if we execute this function, we get this result. Okay, we are not getting any column names here. If we write like this, select star from get employee by id table set, then it will give the desired result. But since we are using procedure, we cannot write select star from, because that we do when we use query annotation. Okay, so this is the problem with procedure annotation. Let's see what happens if we define one more name stored procedure query here, and what result we get if we try to execute our function. So let's copy this and group them together inside name procedure queries. Okay, comma, paste it here. We have only one input parameter this time, and instead of this, let's say get emp id and name. Copy this function name, paste it here. Okay, save this, copy this, paste it here, and here. Now instead of this, get id and department. Okay, now copy this function name, go to employee service and paste it here. Save this, run it. Okay, hit send. See, we are getting blank array here. So this happens when we use procedure annotation to call function which do not have any out parameter and returns data which may have multiple records. So to call such functions and handle the result, we can use entity manager. And to do that, go to employee service.java, and here let's define entity manager em and annotate it with persistence context. Okay, and here let's define stored procedure query svq equal to em dot create named stored procedure query, and we are going to use the named stored procedure query that we have just created. Copy this, paste it here. Now let's say spq dot set parameter, and here employee id, the name of the parameter, and value employee id, and spq dot execute and return the result of spq dot get result list. Okay, now save this, and here let's say for the time being say object, and here object, and kill the terminal, run it again. So let's send this, and here we are getting a set of record, right? Now, if you want to show the column names before these values, you need to define the rule to map this result. Okay, and to do that, just go to your employee.java class, and here annotate this entity with Sql Result Set Mapping. Okay, and inside this we need to set few attributes. First one is name, and here we need to define the mapping name. So let's say this is emp id and name. Okay, then here classes, and inside this specify the class to which we want to bind the result. Okay, so let's create one class first inside our Pojo folder. Let's say emp id and name.java, and specify these two columns here, employee id and employee name. Public int employee id and public string employee name. Okay, let's define the constructor. Save it, and here let's say constructor result. Now target class equal to our emp id and name dot class. Okay, now we need to specify the columns that we are expecting in the result. Okay, so the first column is at column result, and inside this name employee id. Okay, and the second one is column result name equal to employee name. Okay, now save this, and here in our name stored procedure query, map this result to our result mapping. Okay, this one. Now save it, go to employee service.java. Now instead of object we can say list of emp id and name. Okay, save it, kill the terminal, run the application. Now hit send, and we are getting the data, but this time according to our mapping, right? Now let's see the last example, which is how to handle a function which returns cursor in return. Okay, this one. Here we are having out parameter, and this time we are returning cursor. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. Go to your employee.java, and let's specify one more named stored procedure query here, and this time we are getting all data from our employees table. Okay, so get all employees, and we are passing the employee id, and we are getting all data whose employee id is, let's say, greater than this employee id. And here we need to specify the procedure name. Okay, now remove this, and let's say result classes, and here we need to bind the result with our entity class. Okay, so employee dot class, right? Now let's define the parameters. We have this one in parameter, which is employee id. Okay, we are passing the employee id here, and in output we are getting reference cursor. Okay, so the name of our parameter is, let's say, emps, and the type is void class. Okay, and here the sequence of the parameters are important, because when we call function which returns reference cursor, we need to define that parameter at first place. Okay, now let's create one more function in our service class. Let's say get all emp ref. Okay, and it will return list of employee. Copy this name from here, get all employees, paste it here. Now parameter is same, execute and get result list. Now save this. Let's define one more endpoint here. Copy this, paste it, get all emp ref. Okay, get all emp ref. Employee service dot get all emp ref. Okay, copy this. Now run the application. Set this, and we are getting error. Let me tell you what exactly going on. We are getting this error. Okay, cannot mix name parameters and ref cursor parameter on PostgreSQL. So to handle that, what we need to do is we just need to remove this names from here. Okay, and when we set parameter here, instead of using the name of the attribute here that we were using before, we need to specify the place value of that parameter. Okay, and here the in parameter is in second place, right? Now save this, run it again and hit send. Okay, again we are getting error. Now let's see what's going on this time. Cursor unnamed portal 1 does not exist. So to resolve this issue, we just need to add transactional annotation on this property. Okay, so what it exactly does, that it set the auto commit to false, which is by default is true. Okay, and by doing so, we are telling Hibernate that do not close the connection after the first result. Okay, this is a cursor and we are expecting the number of records from the function. Okay, so let's save this and run the application. Okay, and this time we are getting all records, right? You can set auto commit to false globally for your project in your Spring application.properties file. And here you need to specify this property if you want to set it globally, but I prefer the default setting. Okay, and whenever required, I just put this transactional annotation on that function, right? So this is how we call stored procedure in JPA repository. This is it for this video. If you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. Bye bye and take care.